Hello everyone, and welcome to part 3 of our special 9-year anniversary episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be presenting the conclusion of our first ever 3-part series, which covers the 1954 murder of Marilyn Reese Sheppard. Over the past 2 weeks, we've released parts 1 and 2, which outlined all the facts of this case, and if you haven't heard those episodes yet, I suggest you go back and listen to them since I'm going to be discussing a lot of information that I previously shared. To provide a brief recap, 31-year-old Marilyn Reese Sheppard was the wife of a prominent 30-year-old physician named Sam Sheppard. The couple lived in Bay Village, Ohio, a suburb of Cleveland, alongside their 7-year-old son, Sam Sheppard Jr., who went by the nickname Chip, and Marilyn was 4 months pregnant at the time. During the early morning hours of July the 4th, 1954, Marilyn was bludgeoned to death in her bed, and since he had fallen asleep the previous night, Sam claimed he was lying on a daybed downstairs and was wakened by the sound of his wife screaming. When Sam ran upstairs into the bedroom, he said he was knocked unconscious, and after he woke up, he saw what he described as a quote-unquote bushy-haired intruder fleeing the house. Sam chased this intruder outside onto the beach alongside Lake Erie and got into a scuffle with them, but was knocked unconscious again. Well, police suspected that Sam killed Marilyn and fabricated this entire story about the intruder, particularly after they learned that he had been conducting an extramarital affair with a young woman named Susan Hayes, a former lab technician who had worked at his family's hospital. After Sam went through what was described as the trial of the century, he was convicted of Marilyn's murder and received a sentence of life imprisonment. However, he eventually acquired the services of an aspiring defense attorney named F. Lee Bailey, who argued that Sam did not receive a fair trial because of the media's sensationalistic and biased reporting of the crime. Sam's conviction was overturned, and in 1966, the case made it all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and they agreed that Sam's constitutional rights had been violated. Sam went to trial for the second time and wound up being acquitted before he died in 1970. However, since Sam was never officially exonerated, his son Chip would later file a wrongful conviction lawsuit against the state of Ohio in hopes of clearing his late father's name. A civil trial was held about the matter in 2000, and Sam's supporters argued that the real killer was a man named Richard Eberling, who had worked as a window washer at the Sheppard residence at the time of Marilyn's death, and later went to prison for an unrelated murder. However, the jury at the civil trial was not convinced by this argument, and felt the evidence was insufficient to prove Sam's innocence, so they ultimately sided with the state. After 70 years, this case remains shrouded in controversy, and debate still rages on about whether Sam Sheppard was guilty or innocent of murdering his wife. I definitely think there are compelling arguments for both sides, so on this episode, I'm going to perform my own breakdown and analysis before I close things off by sharing my own personal opinion. So without any further ado, I now present part 3 of our series about the murder of Marilyn Reese Sheppard. Okay, I'll start things off by saying that even though I had heard of this case for many years, I never really did a deep dive into it until I started preparing these episodes. I mentioned in my intro to part 1 that this case was featured on one of the earliest episodes of True Crime Garage, the very first one I ever listened to, and I always vowed that I would cover it on The Trail Went Cold someday. The main narrative which seems to be out there is that Sam Sheppard was an innocent man who was wrongly convicted for a crime he did not commit, and while that very well could be true, it's definitely not cut and dried. The fact of the matter is that while Sam may have been acquitted at his second trial back in 1966, he was never conclusively exonerated. If this crime took place today, I think it would probably be fairly easy to solve since we now have DNA profiling and the world of forensics has advanced so much. But 1954 was just a much different time. In recent years, genetic genealogy has paved the way to the resolution of a number of cold cases, some of which were decades old. The great thing about this process is that it can conclusively link DNA evidence from a crime to a suspect who is already deceased, which allows investigators to solve the case even if the perpetrator will never face justice. Since so much time has passed and nearly everyone associated with this case is now dead, I think it's safe to say that no one will ever be arrested for this crime, but unfortunately, since the standards of collecting and preserving evidence were much lower 70 years ago, it may be impossible to posthumously link the murder to a specific suspect. When the civil trial took place in 2000, DNA profiling had still only been a tool in criminal investigations for about a decade or so. The Sheppard estate argued that the results of the DNA testing on the physical evidence proved Sam's innocence and pointed towards another suspect being responsible for the crime. But since there's a decent chance this evidence was contaminated, these results may not prove or disprove anything. Over the years, a number of different books have been published about the Sheppard case, though I was unable to read all of them in preparation for this episode, since some of these books are long out of print. But if you want to perform a balanced analysis of this case, two of the most important books to read are The Wrong Man, The Final Verdict on the Sam Sheppard Murder Case by journalist James Neff, and Dr. Sheppard on Trial, Prosecutors and the Marilyn Sheppard Murder, which was co-written by author Jack Desario and William Mason, one of the prosecutors who represented the state of Ohio at the civil trial. The books came out shortly after the trial took place, and while The Wrong Man is a pro-innocence book, which argues that Sam Sheppard was wrongly convicted and Richard Eberling was the real killer, Dr. Sheppard on Trial pushes forward the narrative that the authorities got the right guy the first time around. Obviously, each side is going to have their own agenda, but I do believe that both books push forward compelling arguments for Sam's guilt and innocence. The website famoustrials.com also has a section about this case, which includes a chart titled, Did Sam Do It? Each side of this chart outlines points favoring Sam's guilt and innocence, and some of these points have valid counterpoints listed beneath them. So you can definitely understand why opinions about this case are so sharply divided. Regardless of how you feel about his guilt or innocence, I'm sure one thing we can all agree on is that Sam Sheppard was definitely not the nicest husband in the world, and he seemed to have an air of entitlement about his extramarital affairs, as he pretty much justified his actions by saying that Marilyn was not particularly good or as passionate about sex following the birth of their son. There was a huge dose of 1950s-style sexism and misogyny in this story, particularly when Sam's brother, Steve Sheppard, once wrote Marilyn a letter to discourage her from divorcing Sam and said that they each held an equal amount of blame for their issues in the marriage, even though Sam was the one who was cheating on her. But at the same time, even though Sam's history of infidelity was well documented, he did not appear to have any documented history of violence or physical abuse prior to Marilyn's murder. Granted, Sam's second wife, Ariane Tabon-Johans, would accuse Sam of threatening her and pulling a gun on her following his release from prison years later, but he was a very embittered man at that point who had serious issues with drugs and alcohol. If Sam ever acted this way towards Marilyn, it does not sound like she ever told anyone about it, and this was still an incredibly brutal crime. However, I have to harken back to the line from a reporter who stated that even though Sam went on trial for murder, he was convicted of adultery. Indeed, I really have no disagreement with the opinion that Sam did not receive a fair trial, and I believe that the Supreme Court's decision to overturn his conviction was the correct one. I've repeatedly mentioned that the original trial was dubbed the trial of the century, and it's not hard to understand why, as this was one of the very first high-profile tries to be broadcast on television, which was still a fairly new medium at the time. It's quite fascinating to view this case through a modern lens, because in recent years, there's been concern that the internet has caused the true crime industry to become too big for its britches. Whenever a high-profile trial takes place these days, it's inevitable that it will be heavily analyzed by podcasts and YouTube shows and endlessly discussed on social media, so of course, misinformation is going to spread and unfairly influence people's opinions. Hell, we still saw this happen at Sam Sheppard's trial when a number of media outlets reported that he had an illegitimate child with a sex worker from New York without properly vetting the story to confirm if she was actually telling the truth. The biggest issue was that the local Cleveland press pretty much branded Sam as the killer before he was even charged with anything and kept pressuring law enforcement to arrest him, even though some people in power did not believe the evidence was strong enough. If Sam's defense team had been granted a change of venue, things might have turned out differently, but since this crime was one of the biggest things that had ever happened in Cuyahoga County at that time, there was no way Sam was ever going to receive a fair trial there. When James Neff published The Wrong Man in 2001, he managed to track down the 5 jurors from the trial who were still alive, and when he asked them why they found Sam guilty, Neff was quite perturbed by the fact that most of their answers were based around Sam's extramarital affairs and what they perceived to be an arrogant and unconvincing demeanor when he took the stand to testify in his own defense. Hell, one juror mentioned that she never liked the Sheppard family, particularly after hearing a rumor that they ran an illegal abortion clinic at Bayview Hospital. I have no idea if that rumor was even true, but since it was never brought up at the trial, it should have had no bearing on that woman's verdict. While they never admitted it, it seemed obvious that since these jurors had been bombarded with biased media coverage and were not sequestered during the trial, they allowed all the sensationalism to influence them and did not convict Sam based solely on the evidence against him. Quite frankly, regardless of your personal opinion about Sam, I'd argue that there really wasn't all that much evidence he committed this crime, and there definitely was not a smoking gun per se. One thing which does cast Sam in a particularly suspicious light is that he initially denied his affair with Susan Hayes during his interviews with police and while he was testifying under oath at Dr. Samuel Gerber's public inquest. Sam claimed he only did this to try to protect Susan's reputation and was acting under the advice of his original defense attorney, Bill Corrigan, which, if true, was really terrible legal advice since Corrigan was essentially advising his client to commit perjury. The whole inquest was a major farce because can you imagine a high-profile murder case taking place today where the prime suspect is forced to answer questions under oath in a high school gymnasium in front of a large crowd of gossipy housewives? Dr. Gerber only held this inquest because the local media pressured him to, but since Corrigan was unable to directly participate or advise his client about anything, he really should have told Sam to exercise his Fifth Amendment privilege and not answer any questions. You'll notice that the authorities really didn't uncover any new evidence against Sam between the inquest and his arrest, but the whole thing had turned into such a spectacle that the police felt that they had to take Sam into custody and were left greatly disappointed when they were unable to extract a confession from him. Now, I definitely have a lot of issues with Sam's account about what happened on the night of the murder, which I'll be discussing later on, but the fact of the matter is that there was no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, and no conclusive physical evidence that Sam committed this crime, and I do not believe his guilt was proven beyond a reasonable doubt. When Sam's retrial took place in 1966, the sensationalism was heavily toned down, which is supported by the fact that the transcripts for the first trial were over 6,000 pages, while the transcripts for the second trial were just under 1,600 pages. Once you stripped away the drama about the extramarital affairs, it became apparent that the state had a very weak case, so I do think the jury made the right decision the second time around when they found Sam not guilty. Now, obviously, this was the case that put F. Lee Bailey on the map and made him one of the most famous defense attorneys in the United States. He always maintained that Sam was an innocent man, but let's not forget that Bailey would become attached to the case which supplanted this one as the trial of the century, and that was O.J. Simpson's trial for the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. Bailey joined Simpson's self-proclaimed dream team of defense attorneys who managed to secure him a not guilty verdict, and for years afterwards, Bailey continued to push forward the theory that the Los Angeles Police Department planted evidence in order to frame O.J. So, needless to say, just because F. Lee Bailey says one of his clients is innocent does not necessarily make it so. It's also worth noting that Bailey eventually wound up being disbarred in the states of Florida and Massachusetts for misconduct, and he filed for bankruptcy a few years before his death in 2021, so regardless of your opinion of his work on this case, he's definitely not without controversy. Before I start analyzing the case any further, I wanted to compare it to another high-profile crime which has a number of interesting parallels, and that's the McDonald family murders, which took place on February the 17th, 1970. In case you're not familiar with the crime, it took place inside a home in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, as 26-year-old Colette McDonald and her 2 daughters, 5-year-old Kimberly and 2-year-old Kristen, were brutally murdered inside their home. The family's 26-year-old patriarch, an Army Special Forces physician named Jeffrey MacDonald, became the prime suspect and would eventually be convicted of all 3 murders, though he has always maintained that he was violently attacked and nearly killed by 4 intruders while he was sleeping on the couch in the living room, and they proceeded to murder his wife and 2 daughters in their respective bedrooms. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? In an ironic turn of events, the first time MacDonald was directly accused of the crime by Army investigators and relieved of his duties was on April 6, 1970, the very same date that Sam Sheppard passed away. In addition to the fact that both accused murderers were doctors, let's look at the similarities between the 2 cases. Much like Sam Sheppard, Jeffrey MacDonald constantly conducted extramarital affairs, and his wife Colette was 3 months pregnant at the time she was murdered. Instead of a mysterious bushy-haired intruder, Jeffrey said that the real killers were a quartet of drug-addicted hippies who said stuff like, quote, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs," which sounds exactly like someone who has never actually met a hippie in their life would assume a gang of hippies talked. Even though Jeffrey appeared to have some injuries, they seemed very minor in comparison to the level of brutality his wife and daughters received, which is why the authorities suspected that he staged the home invasion and self-inflicted his own injuries. Some people have said the same thing about Sam, though the severity of his injuries has always been up for debate. While Jeffrey has continued to maintain his innocence to this very day, it's been theorized that he didn't plan on killing his family that night, but got into a heated argument with Colette that escalated into violence. The same thing may have happened with Sam and Marilyn, though the key difference between the cases is that their son Chip was left unharmed. It's been suspected that Jeffrey never really wanted children to begin with, and used this situation as an opportunity to start over, which is why he later moved to California and showed little interest in finding his family's so-called real killers. I mentioned in our last episode that after his conviction was overturned, Sam collaborated with a journalist named Bill Levy to publish a book about his story titled Endure and Conquer, though years later, Levy would concede that he always thought Sam was guilty. Jeffrey MacDonald did the same thing when he hired an author named Joe McGinnis to write a book about him, but while he assumed it would have a pro-innocence narrative, McGinnis came to the conclusion that Jeffrey was guilty, and the end result was Fatal Vision, one of the most famous true crime books of all time. But even though the book did not come out until after MacDonald was in prison, he sued McGinnis from behind bars for breach of conduct, and the case was later settled out of court, with MacDonald receiving a $325,000 payout. Our final similarity between these 2 cases is that the defendant's pro-innocence supporters have always attempted to point the finger at a specific alternate suspect. In the MacDonald case, the suspect was a young woman named Helena Stokely, who even confessed on multiple occasions that she accompanied her boyfriend and 2 other accomplices to the MacDonald residence in order to rough the doctor up for turning in drug users who frequented his hospital, but they wound up murdering his family in a drug-induced psychotic rage. However, since Stokely was an addict with a history of mental illness who frequently recanted her confessions, she was definitely not a reliable source. Once you start digging into the case, the narrative of Stokely and her hippie friends being the killers falls apart, and you realize that MacDonald is exactly where he belongs. Of course, in the Sheppard case, the biggest alternate suspect is Richard Eberling. We'll talk more about him in a little while, but since we know Eberling washed windows at the Sheppard residence in 1954 and later went to prison for another murder, I would definitely say the case against him is more plausible than the case against Helena Stokely. And finally, if you're looking for one more interesting parallel between these cases, you might recall me mentioning in our last episode that a movie titled The Lawyer came out in 1970, which was heavily inspired by the Sheppard murder and starred actor Barry Newman as the title character, a defense attorney who was clearly modeled on F. Lee Bailey. Well, in 1984, a made-for-TV miniseries adaptation of Fatal Vision was released and featured none other than Barry Newman, who played the role of Jeffrey MacDonald's real-life defense attorney, Bernie Siegel. So yeah, getting to play the attorneys of 2 real-life philandering physicians who went on trial for murdering their pregnant wives is a strangely specific piece of typecasting. Anyway, even though the MacDonald family murders also took place before DNA profiling, one of the main reasons Jeffrey got charged and convicted was because of a genetic anomaly, as Jeffrey, Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen each happened to have a different blood type. Therefore, when investigators were able to type all the blood found in various sections of the MacDonald residence, they realized that Jeffrey's story just did not hold up. But unfortunately, we just do not have the same clarity in the Sheppard case, because while the forensic evidence here has been extensively analyzed, it has failed to provide any conclusive answers about who actually committed this crime. Much like with Jeffrey MacDonald, I definitely think there are elements of Sam Sheppard's version of events which don't make a whole lot of sense, but at the same time, Sam was not a stupid man, so you almost start thinking that if he was guilty, he would have been able to concoct a more plausible cover story. If Sam did kill Marilyn, I don't believe it was premeditated murder, as it was likely a crime of passion in which the couple got into a heated confrontation about something before things escalated into violence. I'm not sure if this point has any bearing on the case at all, but I've always been intrigued by the fact that while working at Bayview Hospital on July the 3rd, Sam performed surgery on a boy who had been hit by a truck, but he did not survive. Sam apparently took the whole thing pretty hard, particularly when the boy's father lashed out at him for failing to save his son's life. So would Sam have really been capable of murdering another human being several hours later? Or was the stress of this whole situation one of just many factors which led to Sam snapping and killing his wife? The last independent eyewitnesses who saw Marilyn alive were Dawn and Nancy Ahern, who attended the dinner party at the Sheppard residence and claimed that Sam and Marilyn were affectionate towards each other and there were no obvious warning signs that something was wrong. The Aherns were also able to confirm that Sam was exhausted and still sleeping on the downstairs daybed when Marilyn escorted them out of the house. Sam always maintained that he remained asleep there for the next 4 or 5 hours before he was awakened by Marilyn screaming upstairs, but if he's lying, you have to wonder what led to him waking up and committing murder. One point which has always been brought up to discredit Sam's story is the fact that Chip managed to sleep through his mother's murder, but I'm not sure this necessarily disproves the idea that there was an intruder in the house. It's an indisputable fact that Marilyn was bludgeoned to death in the guest bedroom just down the hall from Chip's room, and he was still fast asleep that morning when everyone else arrived at the house following the murder. So even if Sam did it, that still means that Chip managed to sleep through the whole thing. I suppose it's possible that Sam could have been woken up by the noise and witnessed his father murdering his mother before he went back to bed, and he has somehow managed to repress it from his memory. But it's been 70 years now, and Chip fought so diligently to clear his father's name once he reached adulthood, so I have my doubts that he would have stayed silent for this long if he saw something incriminating. Chip was described as being a very sound sleeper, and Sam was apparently the same way, so I don't think you can dismiss the possibility of them failing to wake up if an intruder entered the house. Now, a number of Sam's actions on the morning of the crime have struck people as unusual, and on the surface, I'm inclined to agree. But you have to ask yourself, how much of his behavior was the result of him suffering serious injuries which left him shocked and disoriented? For instance, the authorities initially became suspicious of the fact that instead of calling the police or an ambulance, the first person that Sam phoned for help was Spencer Houck, as it's been theorized that Sam was hoping to use his friendship with the town mayor as a shield to protect him from being thoroughly investigated by law enforcement. However, you have to remember that this was all the way back in 1954, before 911 was a thing, and phones did not have speed dials on them. If you wanted to call the police, you either had to write down their phone number or memorize it, and if Sam had been violently attacked and was in a state of shock, I would not be surprised if he could not recall what the Bay Village Police Department's number was, so he decided to call the Houcks because it was the first number that popped into his head. Investigators also had issues with the fact that when Sam initially shared his account about what happened, it was very vague, and he wound up gradually adding more details each time he was interviewed by the police, and no formal signed statement was taken from him until 6 days after the murder. But again, if Sam suffered some sort of concussion and was in a state of shock, did his recollection of certain details just not pop into his head until after the fact? I'm not saying that the authorities shouldn't have looked at Sam as a suspect, but the issue is that it seems like they made up their mind that he was the perpetrator almost immediately, and I hope that didn't cause them to neglect or overlook other possibilities. Obviously, when you examine Sam's story from beginning to end, there do seem to be some notable holes. The first issue with the intruder scenario is that there were no signs of forced entry, but no one could be certain if Marilyn even locked the front door before she went to bed that night. I know that older folks often like to romantically describe eras where you didn't have to lock your front door, but given that the Sheppards were living in a peaceful, upscale suburb in 1954, this was apparently common practice with them, so it's possible that an intruder simply walked into the house during the middle of the night. They then headed upstairs and attempted to sexually assault Marilyn in the guest bedroom, but either didn't notice Sam lying on the daybed in the living room, or were just so brazen that they felt they could go through with this with Sam still inside the house. Now, the drawers were pulled out of some desks in the downstairs area, but since nothing appeared to be missing, and some of the drawers were neatly stacked on top of each other, the authorities believe that Sam staged the scene in an attempt to make the crime look like a burglary gone wrong. Indeed, if there was an intruder, I seriously doubt they could have done all this without waking Sam up, but if they did it after Sam was knocked unconscious in the guest bedroom, that's a different story. After all, Sam claimed that when he woke up, he saw the bushy-haired intruder downstairs before they fled the house, so they may have been in the midst of attempting a burglary before Sam chased them outside. Sam said that when he was woken up by Marilyn screaming, he ran into the guest bedroom to see what he described as a quote-unquote form with a white garment before he felt himself get knocked out from behind. If there was only one person involved in this crime, then I'm not exactly sure how Sam could get knocked out from behind when the killer was standing right in front of them, but if the Houcks were the perpetrators, Sam could have been knocked out by Spencer while Esther was murdering Marilyn. After all, Sam only described the person he saw as a quote-unquote form and never specified a gender, which means he could have seen a woman standing over Marilyn in the darkness without being able to identify her. Of course, the big issue is that even though the Houcks were accused of being the real killers for years, the focus eventually switched to Richard Eberling, and I'm not exactly sure how Sam could have been hit from behind if Eberling was the sole perpetrator standing in front of him. But we'll get back to this issue in a little while. Another detail which really made police suspicious is Sam's claim that when he first woke up in the bedroom, he noticed his wallet on the floor and put it back in his pocket before he checked on Marilyn, which you wouldn't think would be a top priority. But I guess it depends on how woozy he was at the time. It sounds like Sam's story is that he still had the wallet in his pocket when he went to sleep on the daybed, so the implication seems to be that after the intruder knocked Sam out, they removed the wallet but inexplicably decided not to take it. The wallet contained a check for $1,000, three $20 bills in a hidden compartment, a number of cards, and only one single $1 bill that was visible. If the intruder had no need for the check and didn't notice the hidden compartment with the extra money, they may have felt there was nothing worth taking and just left the wallet on the bedroom floor, but curiously, no traces of blood were found on the wallet or in Sam's pants pocket, even though they had just fatally bludgeoned Marilyn and would have presumably got blood on themselves. In addition, Sam never mentioned collecting the wallet in his earliest statements to police, and only added this detail when detectives asked him why he still had his wallet on him when Dr. Gerber collected his clothing as evidence. Sam said that after he regained consciousness, he looked downstairs and saw an intruder in the house, so he chased this person outside onto the beach, got into a struggle with them, and was knocked unconscious for the second time. It's never been made clear how exactly Sam was rendered unconscious, as in one version of his story, he claimed he was choked, though there did not appear to be any marks or bruises on his neck to support this. It definitely seems strange that this alleged intruder would kill Marilyn, yet leave Sam alive by nearly knocking him unconscious not once, but twice. Even though Marilyn's pajama top was pulled up and her pajama bottom was pulled down, it does not appear that any rape occurred, and one reason why investigators felt the attempted sexual assault was staged was because Marilyn's legs were pulled underneath the bed's crossbar, so she was found in a position where it would have been difficult to penetrate her. But let's assume there was an intruder. After Sam was knocked out, the intruder may have thought twice about raping Marilyn, so he decided to bludgeon her to death before heading back downstairs to attempt a burglary. However, she was struck a total of 35 times, and her face was pretty much unrecognizable, so this does suggest a more personal crime. Even though most of the fingerprints found at the residence were smudged and unidentifiable, one of the few clear ones was Sam's thumbprint, which was on the headboard of Marilyn's bed. While he could have left the print there while committing the murder, this was Sam's residence, so it's not implausible that the print was already on the headboard long before the crime took place. But on the other hand, due to the recent marital issues, Marilyn had been sleeping in the guest bedroom, which had twin beds, rather than with Sam in the double bed of the master bedroom. Would Sam have frequented the guest bedroom enough to leave his thumbprint there? From my point of view, the one part of Sam's story which has never made any sense to me is the discovery of the canvas bag on the nearby hillside containing a couple of stolen items, including Sam's watch, which he believed was taken from his wrist after he was knocked unconscious on the beach. He claimed that this canvas bag was ordinarily used for his boat tools, so after Sam was knocked out in the bedroom, I suppose it's possible that the intruder found the bag and was planning to start loading items into it, but was interrupted and forced to flee when Sam woke up, which would explain why nothing valuable appeared to be missing from the home. They then stole Sam's wristwatch after he was knocked out on the beach and put it inside the bag, but what I don't understand is why they would abandon it on the hillside. Now, one detail which Sam's supporters have brought up to discredit the idea that he staged the scene is that one of his high school track and field trophies was found damaged and scratched on the floor. Sam was apparently quite proud of this trophy, so if he wanted to ransack his house to make it look like a burglary took place, why intentionally damage one of his most prized possessions? Another detail which is used to poke holes in the intruder theory is that no one reported hearing the family dog, Coco, bark that night, even though she was known for reacting to strangers in the house. But the problem is that we don't know Coco's exact location throughout the course of the night, so for all we know, she could have been quietly sleeping in a corner somewhere and completely missed what happened. To play devil's advocate, some of the other people who have been pushed forward as alternate suspects, such as Esther Houck, Spencer Houck, and Richard Eberling, were known to have frequented the Sheppard residence on previous occasions. In fact, during one of his many conversations he had about this case years later, Eberling said that he had no recollection of Coco ever having barked at him whenever he showed up to the house on a window washing job. So theoretically, even if Coco saw any of these people inside the residence in the middle of the night, she may have been familiar enough with them to not react and start barking. Getting back to the wristwatch, there were small traces of blood on it and numerous theories about how it wound up there. The authorities believed it was blood spatter from Sam bludgeoning Marilyn, while Sam initially believed that he got the blood via contact transfer when he checked Marilyn's pulse right after he regained consciousness in the bedroom. But the biggest hole in either of these theories is that there appeared to be blood spots on the inside of the watch band, which suggests that some blood was transferred there after it was removed from Sam's wrist. If there was an intruder, they could have got the blood on the watch after they took it from Sam, but alternatively, Sam could have left the blood there himself before he placed the watch inside the canvas bag. Another detail which looks suspicious is that the watch was stopped at 4:15, which may have been the result of getting waterlogged, but Sam did not call the house for help until 5:40 a.m. Assuming that water got on the watch while Sam struggled with the intruder on the outskirts of Lake Erie, would Sam really have been unconscious for nearly an hour and a half before he woke up and called for help? Or was the big gap in the timeline the result of Sam using this time to stage the scene and cover up his own involvement in the crime? The issue is that we really can't nail down Marilyn's exact time of death, as following the autopsy, Dr. Lester Adelson believed that she died between 4:15 and 4:45 a.m., whereas Dr. Gerber told the press that she died sometime between 3 and 4 a.m., in what I'm sure was a calculated attempt to influence public opinion about Sam's guilt. But since Sam claimed he was knocked unconscious on at least 2 occasions and never provided an exact timeline for how long he was out, it's hard to know if Marilyn's time of death is even a factor in figuring out whether or not Sam did this. There's also some controversy over the fact that Marilyn's wristwatch was found in the study, and Dr. Gerber told the press that it had stopped at 3:17, but at least one policeman claimed that they saw the watch at around 11:30 that morning and it was still running and had the correct time. So I'm not even sure Marilyn's watch stopped during the attack, and Dr. Gerber may have once again been sharing misinformation to further his narrative. It is worth mentioning that a neighbor across the street from the Sheppard residence had recalled seeing the upstairs and downstairs lights on at around 2:15 a.m., even though the Aherns left at 12:30, and Sam and Marilyn should have both been asleep in their respective rooms at that point. I mean, it's possible the neighbor was mistaken or misremembered the date, but if they are accurate, then this suggests that something was happening in the house and would point towards Sam being the guilty party, since he never mentioned being awake at that time. Since Marilyn was found in her bed in her pajamas, she obviously had tried to go to sleep at some point, but did Sam just head upstairs and wake her up in the middle of the night to start an argument? When Sam went to sleep on the daybed the previous night, the Aherns confirmed that he was dressed in a corduroy jacket and a brown t-shirt, but this has always created an air of suspicion around Sam since his corduroy jacket was found neatly folded on the daybed and his t-shirt was never found at all. Obviously, it doesn't make sense for Sam to remove his jacket and fold it if he was awakened by the sound of his wife screaming and had to rush upstairs. While Sam could not say this with any certainty, he felt he may have removed his jacket in the middle of the night when he was half awake and then fell back asleep again. Indeed, I think we've all gone through the experience of going to bed and then waking up to discover that an article of clothing we were wearing has been removed, even though we have no recollection of waking up and doing this. People are definitely capable of doing things while they're half awake without remembering them. However, the discrepancy with Sam's missing t-shirt is harder to explain, as when detectives asked what happened to it, he simply replied, quote, "I don't know," and could only speculate that the intruder may have removed the shirt after he was knocked unconscious. But why would they go to the trouble of doing this? It's been theorized that Sam disposed of the shirt himself because it had incriminating evidence on it, such as blood, but if that was the case, it's odd that he would continue to wear the same pair of pants which had a blood stain on the left knee. And I once again have to harken back to the question of why Sam would have been able to brainstorm a better story than, "Gee, I don't know what happened to the shirt." He apparently owned a number of other identical white t-shirts, so if he had to dispose of the one he had been wearing, he easily could have put another shirt on before he called for help, and no one would have known the difference. We know that a stained white t-shirt was found on a prong of wire near the Sheppard property 10 days after the crime took place, though it was never conclusively identified as Sam's shirt. If this crime happened today, I'm sure DNA testing could answer the question of who it belonged to, but it didn't have any blood on it, so if the shirt was Sam's, I'm not sure why he would need to get rid of it. But I'm also not sure why anyone else would need to take the shirt and leave it there either. But on the other side of the coin, the physical evidence on Sam's pants did seem to support his story about being knocked down into the water on the beach, as his pants were wet and had traces of sand in them. Investigators suspected that Sam intentionally went into the water in order to clean himself off and get rid of blood evidence, but even Mary Cowan, the chief medical technologist at the Cuyahoga County Coroner's Office, testified that blood cannot be completely removed from fabric. Sam may have gotten the stain when he knelt in Marilyn's blood in the bedroom while checking her pulse, but there did not appear to be any signs of blood spatter. So could he have bludgeoned her to death and gotten spatter on his shirt, but not his pants? Obviously, one of the most controversial and divisive elements of this case are the seriousness of Sam's injuries. There's no doubt that he sustained injuries to his face since he was bruised and swollen, but could these have been caused by Marilyn fighting back against him? In regards to Sam's neck injuries, I certainly don't believe that Sam would have taken the risk of fracturing his own vertebra in order to simulate an attack, and numerous medical experts expressed their opinions that there was no way that Sam's injuries could have been faked. Under normal circumstances, there probably wouldn't be so much debate about this topic, but the issue is that Sam was treated by his own brother Steve at a hospital belonging to the Sheppard family. So if Steve wanted to protect Sam, he easily could have exaggerated his injuries. At the civil trial in 2000, it was heavily implied that Sam's X-ray from July the 4th, the day of the crime, had been switched with an X-ray belonging to another patient with a legitimate neck injury, as Sam's X-ray from July the 7th seemed to show a remarkable amount of healing after only 3 days. Well, I think my biggest issue with the switched X-ray theory is that these X-rays were examined by a lot of different experts back in 1954, including Dr. Samuel Gerber, who was 100% convinced that Sam was guilty. I do think that if a switcheroo had taken place, someone would have noticed at the time, as this whole theory wasn't presented until decades after the fact. There have been allegations that Sam's family knew exactly what he had done, such as when Spencer Houck testified at the first trial and claimed that he witnessed Sam's other brother, Richard, flat out ask him if he killed Marilyn. Both brothers denied that this conversation ever took place, and indeed, it does seem odd that Spencer never said anything for months until he took the witness stand, and this was only after rumors had started spreading about Spencer having an affair with Marilyn and possibly being involved in her death. so I can understand Spencer attempting to deflect suspicion from himself. It's also worth noting that even though an ambulance showed up to the Sheppard residence that morning to transport Sam to Bayview Hospital, Steve decided to drive him there in his own car. And during Sam's initial interview with detectives from the Cleveland Police Department, Steve kept walking into the room to interrupt them, and over the course of the next few days, seemed to be trying to prevent his brother from facing too much scrutiny from law enforcement. Even though no one directly accused Steve of anything back in 1954, it was heavily implied at the civil trial decades later that Sam may have summoned Steve to his residence after he killed Marilyn in order to seek his help with orchestrating a cover-up. Steve then went back home and waited for Richard's wife, Dorothy, to phone him and tell him about what happened at 6:08 a.m. But the problem is that Marilyn's stepmother, Jane Reese, claimed that Steve phoned her and her husband to inform them about the murder at 6 a.m., even though he should not have even known about it at that point. Of course, I'm not going to take Jane's story as gospel, since she shared it at the civil trial over 46 years after the fact, and she was also 92 at that point, so I could see her misremembering the exact time that Steve phoned her. But Fred Drenkin, the first police officer who showed up at the scene, would claim that when Steve and his wife Betty arrived at the residence at 6:20 a.m., they appeared to be freshly showered and well-groomed, even though they had only been woken up by Dorothy's phone call 12 minutes earlier, and it should have taken them at least 12 minutes to drive there from their place in Rocky River. So could this mean that Steve had already paid a visit to the house that morning and knew exactly what he was walking into? We also have accounts from Steve's neighbors who thought they saw his Jaguar leaving his residence at around 4:30 a.m., which is only 15 minutes after Sam's watch stopped. So if Sam needed to call his brother for assistance, this sounds like the approximate time he would have done so that morning. But the issue is how much we can really trust people's memories and recollections of the exact times these events supposedly took place. Unfortunately, I'm assuming that police did not have the technology to check phone records in 1954, because I think that would have offered some clarification about the whole situation. Since cell phones did not exist, and I don't know where the nearest payphone was, Sam probably would have needed to call Steve from his house phone. And if a call like that had shown up on Sam's phone records, then this would have destroyed the credibility of his entire story and proven his guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. Prior to this, whenever there appeared to be issues in Sam and Marilyn's marriage, other members of the Sheppard family would intervene and try to convince Marilyn to stick with them. If they went this far to prevent the stigma of a divorce, I have no trouble believing that they would have gone the extra mile to protect their family name by helping Sam cover up a murder. Since Sam's mother, Ethel Sheppard, died by suicide following his conviction and made another failed suicide attempt before his trial even started, you have to wonder if she may have known something incriminating about her son. I think we could probably get a better handle on what actually happened here if we knew for certain what the murder weapon was. Of course, the original theory from Dr. Gerber was that the murder weapon was a surgical instrument which Sam just happened to have lying around in his house, even though he could never actually find a surgical instrument that matched the imprint found on Marilyn's bloodstained pillow. The state of Ohio believed that the big aha moment at the civil trial was the testimony from Paul Gerhardt, who claimed that he repaired a lamp and placed it on the nightstand in the guest bedroom 2 days before Marilyn's death. Since the lamp supposedly vanished without explanation, this meant it could have been the murder weapon. If this was an unplanned domestic homicide and Sam went into a violent rage, it would make sense that he would pick up the nearest object in the room and use it to bludgeon Marilyn. While it was alleged that this lamp matched the imprint on the pillow, Chip has always maintained that there was never a lamp in the guest bedroom and that Gerhardt was misremembering things, and to be fair, he was testifying about this over 45 years after the fact. And not to accuse Gerhardt of lying, but he was the brother of Esther Hauk, who had once been accused of being the killer, so I'm sure he had his own reasons to make people believe that Sam was the one who did it. If the murder weapon was the lamp, there wouldn't have been any reason for an intruder to take it with them when they left, but some people have argued that the imprint was not even from the murder weapon and may have simply been the result of the pillow folding over on clotted blood. Perhaps the most likely choice to be the murder weapon was the dented flashlight found in Lake Erie near the Sheppard residence in August of 1955, 1 year after the murder. Of course, this was after Sam had already been convicted, but it's never been clarified if the Sheppards had ever owned a flashlight like this or kept one in their residence. If they didn't, then it makes sense that an intruder may have brought it to the house with them. And unfortunately, the flashlight was the one piece of evidence which just happened to go missing before the case was reinvestigated decades later, as it could have been useful at helping figure out the identity of the killer. Now, one incriminating piece of evidence which surfaced before the civil trial is the copy of Endure and Conquer that Sam had signed for Phyllis Moretti, and also appeared to have the word yes written under the sentence, "Did Sam do it?" Even though the word was only 3 letters long, a handwriting expert seemed convinced that Sam was the one who wrote yes, but if true, this took place after Sam had already been acquitted at his retrial, so no matter what, he was never going to be charged with his wife's murder again due to double jeopardy. If Sam was guilty, you could almost consider this to be a 1960s version of O.J. Simpson's infamous post-acquittal book, If I Did It, and given that he was struggling with a pill and alcohol addiction at this point, I could see Sam losing his inhibitions and being brazen enough to do something like that. After all, the guy literally started a pro wrestling career under the name Killer Sam Sheppard, and while I can appreciate a good wrestling heel who knows how to draw crowds who pay to see him get beaten, this is still a pretty odd thing to do after you've spent several years fighting for your innocence. All that being said, I've seen a photograph of the page from Endure and Conquer where Sam supposedly wrote yes, and I do think there's some ambiguity here. The sentence, "Did Sam do it?" actually appears alongside another sentence which reads, quote, "Even the most anti-Sheppard reader will find some doubts," and the word yes is written right over it. Sam's supporters have argued that he wasn't writing yes to answer the question, "Did Sam do it?" but rather confirming that even those who believed he was guilty might change their mind after reading the book. Whatever the case, I have not heard any other stories of Sam confessing his guilt to people following his acquittal, and even though Ariane Tevin Johans claimed that she experienced some threatening behavior from him, I don't believe she ever accused him of admitting to Marilyn's murder. So it does seem odd that Sam would suddenly decide to make a confession while signing a book for someone he barely knew. If Sam had overcome his addiction issues and lived longer, it would have been interesting to see if he tried harder to clear his name and find Marilyn's real killer, as it seems like his son had to do this on his behalf long after he was gone. However, unlike, say, the O.J. Simpson case, there do seem to be some plausible alternate suspects who could have committed the crime. At first, the most prominent alternate suspects were Esther and Spencer Houck, but as the years went on, most of the attention would be diverted towards Richard Eberling. However, in April of 2002, 2 years after the conclusion of the civil trial, a former FBI agent named Bernard Connors published a book titled Tailspin: The Strange Case of Major Call, which presented yet another potential suspect in the Sheppard murder. The subject of the book was Major James Arlen Call, a World War II veteran with the United States Air Force, who went AWOL from the Barksdale Air Force Base in Bossier Parish, Louisiana, in May of 1954, before embarking on a multi-state crime spree which involved committing dozens of burglaries and robberies. On August the 5th of that year, Call fatally shot a policeman named Richard Pelkey during a shootout in Lake Placid, New York, and became the subject of a massive nationwide manhunt before he was finally captured in Reno, Nevada in November. After pleading guilty to second-degree murder, Call received a sentence of 20 years to life in prison, but even though he was paroled after serving 14 years, he was killed in a car accident on May the 5th, 1974, at the age of 45. Well, the crash took place near the town of Manaway, Ohio, which is just over 30 miles southeast of Cleveland, and according to Tailspin, Call had visited his sister there in early July of 1954. Call had bushy hair at that time, and in addition to Sam's account of the intruder, 2 witnesses had reported seeing an unidentified bushy-haired man in a white shirt near the Sheppard residence on the morning of the crime, though their account has been called into question since they did not come forward until after Sam offered a $10,000 reward for information several days later. Regardless, these witnesses were asked to look at a photograph of Call in 2000, and while they couldn't positively identify him, they said that he had the closest resemblance to the bushy-haired man of anyone they had ever seen. The day after the murder took place, a motorist reported picking up a young male hitchhiker in the town of Ashtabula, located about 70 miles northeast of Bay Village. The motorist noticed that the hitchhiker had blood on his shoes, which he said he had gotten from kicking a dead dog off the road, and the man also seemed intent on checking the radio for newscasts about the Sheppard murder. In 1997, this motorist looked at Call's photograph and identified him as the hitchhiker. When he was captured following his manhunt, Call had a Luger pistol in his possession, which seemed similar to the imprint found on Marilyn's blood-stained pillow. He also had an injury to his forefinger that resembled a bite mark, was walking with a limp, and he was a known smoker. I mentioned in episode 1 that a cigarette butt had been seen in the Sheppard's upstairs toilet on the morning of the murder, even though Sam and Marilyn did not smoke, but it was never collected as evidence and had gone missing before Sam's trial. Call did not have a verifiable alibi during the time period of the murder, as he simply stated that he had been alone on the Adirondack Trail in New York State on July the 4th. However, no hard evidence has ever surfaced to link Call to this crime. On the surface, Tailspin does make a fairly compelling case for Call being Marilyn's killer, but since he was never thoroughly investigated by law enforcement, I don't really have a strong opinion on him one way or the other. Call was briefly questioned about the crime following his capture, but since Sam was already in custody awaiting trial by that point, Call wasn't pressed very hard. Since Call went on a crime spree during the summer of 1954 in which he committed burglaries in multiple states, it's certainly possible that he picked out the Sheppard residence completely at random and broke into it, but I'm not sure why he would kill Marilyn in such a brutal fashion. His only known victim was Richard Pelkey, a police officer he killed in a shootout while trying to escape, but there doesn't seem to be anything in his background to suggest that he was a sexual predator who liked to assault and murder women. I certainly don't discount the possibility that Marilyn was killed by Call or some other random perpetrator with no personal connection to her, but for the rest of this episode, I'm going to focus on the known suspects. Getting back to Esther and Spencer Houck, F. Lee Bailey knew that he would need to present compelling alternate suspects to the jury if he wanted to secure an acquittal at Sam's retrial, and he ultimately felt there was a stronger case to be made for the Houcks rather than Richard Eberling, even though he wasn't allowed to use their names or directly accuse them at the trial. It's actually surprising that Bailey said he based this decision on the fact that Eberling had passed a polygraph, as we all know that polygraphs were unreliable, but to be fair, back in 1966, Eberling had not been linked to any other murders, so as far as anyone knew, he was nothing more than a petty thief who liked to steal from people's homes while washing their windows. Well, Esther and Spencer did not have any criminal history at all, so it may have been a risk to point the brunt of the suspicion towards them, but since Sam wound up being acquitted, the strategy did technically pay off. I mentioned in our last episode that after the film rights for Endure and Conquer were sold to Paramount Pictures, they produced a fictionalized movie titled The Lawyer, which was heavily inspired by this case and released in 1970. The film concludes by showing a possible scenario where the characters based on Marilyn and Spencer are conducting a secret affair, but when the character based on Esther finds out about it, she bludgeons Marilyn to death in her bed, and Spencer helps his wife cover up the crime. It's apparent there was major public sentiment at that time about the Houcks being the real killers, but if these allegations were false, then Spencer and Esther suffered a lot of undue damage to their reputations. They had both already passed away by the time suspicion started turning towards Richard Eberling. But even if Eberling didn't do it either, you're going to feel much less concern about the reputation of a guy serving time in prison for another murder rather than a pair of law-abiding citizens like the Houcks. Since Sam described getting hit from behind while looking at a mysterious figure standing next to Marilyn's bed, I can understand why Bailey gravitated towards a scenario where there were two people involved in the crime. I know this couldn't be mentioned at the retrial, but Sam agreed to undergo hypnosis in hopes that he might remember more details about the night of the murder, and he started sharing information which seemed to point towards the Houcks, such as the killer sporting a limp, which Spencer happened to have in his right leg. However, before Sam underwent the hypnosis, Bailey had already expressed his belief that the Houcks were the perpetrators, and it's been implied that Bailey was none too subtly trying to influence Sam into suddenly recalling more details which pointed towards them. The involvement of the Houcks would also help account for the burglary looking like it was staged, as the theory pushed forward is that after Sam was knocked out, Esther left the house and returned home, while Spencer remained behind and started pulling the drawers out of the desks because he wanted to give off the false impression that Marilyn had been killed by a burglar during a home invasion. However, there are just so many issues with the Houck theory, such as the idea that Spencer would sneak out of his home in the middle of the night, head over to the Sheppard residence, and then go upstairs to have sex with Marilyn in the guest bedroom while Sam was still sleeping downstairs on the daybed. In fact, since Spencer hadn't been over at the house that night, how would he even know ahead of time that Sam was sleeping downstairs and wasn't in the same room as Marilyn? And if Sam ran into the bedroom while Esther was killing Marilyn, it's strange that Spencer would knock Sam unconscious, but then elect not to kill him, even though he could potentially identify Esther as the perpetrator. Yes, Sam said that he didn't get a look at the person inside the room, but the house couldn't have known that, and Spencer also got incredibly lucky that Sam would chase him out of the house and struggle with him on the beach, yet Sam still didn't get a good enough look at him to make an identification. In addition, it would be a remarkable coincidence if Sam called the house for help later that morning without knowing that they were the ones responsible for Marilyn's murder. Of course, years later, Richard Eberling told Chip that following his release from prison, Sam had confessed to him that he was having a secret gay affair with Spencer and helped the house cover up the murder so no one would find out. I personally think that Eberling is full of it, but even if this scenario was true, I don't know why Sam would confess about something like that to the guy he used to wash his windows. Another big issue with the whole theory is that even though rumors did circulate that Marilyn and Spencer had been carrying on an affair, this was never conclusively proven, and if there was no truth to the rumor, what reason would either of the Houcks have to go over to the Sheppard residence in the middle of the night? It's interesting how there seemed to be hints that Marilyn was having a secret affair with someone, including the account from Jessie Dill, who was certain she had spoken to Marilyn in Fairport Harbor in the weeks prior to the murder, and heard her mention being involved with another man besides her husband. If it had ever been conclusively established that Marilyn was carrying on an extramarital affair, I might look at this case in a much different light, as it could have given her secret lover a motive to harm her. Dill said that the woman she spoke to seemed fearful of her secret boyfriend, so if Marilyn told him that she was not planning to leave her husband, things could have escalated into murder. Alternatively, if Sam discovered that Marilyn was cheating on him, or another man was the father of her unborn child, that could have given him a motive to kill her. I know that paternity testing has been unable to provide a conclusive answer about this, but the Cuyahoga County coroner did believe that in all probability, Sam was likely the child's father, though if Sam legitimately believed that someone else was the father, it could have driven him into a rage. Given how frequently Sam cheated on her, I certainly wouldn't have judged Marilyn if she had decided to cheat on him, but I don't want to potentially taint the reputation of a murder victim without conclusive evidence, and I have to think that if Marilyn was involved with someone else, that information would have come to light at some point. So now we need to talk about Richard Eberling, who definitely seems like the most likely candidate to have been the killer if Sam didn't do this. Since he washed windows at the Sheppard residence in the past and was familiar with the layout of the house, it doesn't seem implausible that he would have decided to perform a home invasion and sexually assault Marilyn in the middle of the night. If the door was left unlocked, and Eberling knew that the Sheppards often did this, this would explain the lack of forced entry. Unlike the Houcks, we know that Eberling was most definitely capable of murder, and while he has only officially been linked to the murder of Ethel Mae Durkin, he has been looked at as a potential suspect in a couple of other suspicious deaths and could technically have been a serial killer. The 1962 murder of Durkin's sister, Myrtle Frey, is particularly interesting because she was fatally bludgeoned, suffocated, and strangled inside her apartment in the middle of the night while she was sleeping, and while it was never proven that Eberling actually did this, the crime does have similarities to Marilyn's murder. It's also interesting how Durkin was killed by a blow to the back of the neck, as it sounds like she was struck in a similar fashion to how Sam claimed he was struck. During Eberling's prison conversations with Chip Sheppard and James Neff, he spoke of Marilyn in very glowing terms and practically described her as a saintly woman, so it definitely sounds like he had an obsession with her. By contrast, he described Sam as being a quote-unquote prick and acted like he didn't deserve Marilyn, so if Eberling was the guilty party, I could see him taking some smug satisfaction over the fact that Sam took the fall for his crime. While it sounds like Eberling was capable of committing this murder, I guess the big question is whether he would have been brazen enough to do so while Sam was in the house. If Eberling entered the residence through the unlocked front door, he surely would have seen Sam sleeping on the daybed next to the staircase. But let's also not forget that he couldn't have known about the daybed beforehand, so how could he even be certain that Sam was not sleeping in the same bedroom as Marilyn? Of course, some criminals, such as Joseph DeAngelo, the East Area rapist / Golden State Killer, would break into homes where couples lived and tie up the male partner while they raped the woman, so Sam's presence may not have dissuaded Eberling. Whatever the case, even though some sperm heads were apparently discovered during Marilyn's vaginal swab, they were so minute that they may have been left there when she had consensual sex long before the murder took place, so even though her pajama bottoms were pulled down, I don't think the killer penetrated her or ejaculated. Was this because Eberling was interrupted before he had the chance to assault Marilyn, or was the whole scene staged to look like an attempted sexual assault? We definitely know that Eberling had a history of burglary, but the ransacking at the Sheppard residence appeared to be staged and nothing of value was stolen. Like I mentioned earlier, if the Houcks were the perpetrators, I could see Spencer pulling out all the drawers and neatly stacking them in order to give off the false impression that Marilyn was killed by a burglar. But if Eberling was the killer, this means that after he knocked Sam unconscious, he decided to abandon his plans for a sexual assault and bludgeon Marilyn to death before he went downstairs and started tearing apart the place to search for valuables. I suppose that if Sam woke up relatively quickly, that could explain why Eberling fled the house and didn't take anything of value with him. However, that doesn't explain why he would steal Sam's watch from his wrist, place it inside a canvas bag containing other stolen items, and then just abandon the bag on a nearby hillside, unless, of course, he wasn't thinking clearly and dropped the bag in a panic as he was fleeing. Now, the main reason Eberling popped up on the radar as a suspect to begin with was because 2 of Marilyn's rings were found in his possession in 1959. Even though it was established that Eberling stole the rings from Richard Sheppard's residence long after the murder took place, it's strange that Eberling would still have them in his possession years later. After all, it's not like he could make any money off these rings unless he sold them or pawned them, so this makes me wonder if perhaps he wanted to keep them as some sort of memento from his crime because of his weird obsession with Marilyn. When Eberling was charged with larceny, one of the detectives attempted to call his bluff by asking him why his blood was found at the Sheppard residence. And even though this detail wasn't actually true, Eberling still provided a story about having cut his finger and bled at the Sheppard residence on July 2, 1954, 2 days before the murder took place, and he kept changing and adding details each time he retold the story. Many years later, one of Eberling's former employees, Vern Lund, claimed that he was the one who washed the windows at the Sheppard residence on July 2nd, and Eberling wasn't even there that day. So does this mean Eberling actually shed blood inside the house on July 4th and felt he had to retroactively come up with a story to account for it? I know that luminol testing seemed to show traces of a blood trail throughout the house, and there have been a number of theories pushed forward to explain it, which include Coco the dog dripping blood all over the place during menstruation. There's always been a lot of debate about whether Marilyn bit or scratched her attacker and caused them to bleed, but since Sam did not have any wounds or bite marks when he was examined following the murder, it's very unlikely that he was responsible for the blood trail. Following his arrest in 1959, Eberling's booking card described him as having a scar on the underside of his left wrist, which could have been a bite mark or a gouge. But it's worth noting that when Eberling was involved in the car accident, which claimed the life of his girlfriend, Barbara Kinzel, in July of 1956, the booking card made no mention of a scar on Eberling's wrist, so if he didn't have it at that point, this rules out the possibility of the scar being caused by Marilyn. We do know that Eberling testified as a witness at Sam's retrial in 1966, but at no point did Sam ever identify him as the man he chased to the beach and had a struggle with. Of course, since it was dark outside, Sam may not have gotten a good look at his face, so I can give him the benefit of the doubt that he didn't recognize Eberling. We also have the account from Kathy Collins Dial that Eberling confessed to Marilyn's murder in front of her in 1983, but this was never corroborated, and she did not come forward until the case started garnering a lot of publicity during the 1990s, and it's been suspected that she may have felt like she could capitalize on it. While it's true that Eberling made some cryptic comments about Marilyn after he was convicted of Ethel May Durkin's murder, he never flat out confessed to killing her. While he received a sentence of life imprisonment for the Durkin murder, Eberling was still holding out hope that he might have his conviction overturned or eventually get paroled, which could explain why he wanted to avoid being implicated in other crimes. But other than a very unreliable jailhouse snitch, there are no other independent eyewitnesses other than Dial who reported hearing Eberling confess to Marilyn's murder. So now I think would be an appropriate time to talk about the physical evidence as well as the DNA testing that was performed by Dr. Mohammed Tarif during the 1990s. Sam's supporters have always maintained that the results of the testing clear him, but since the evidence was not properly handled or preserved back in 1954, there could have been so much contamination that the results may not mean anything. Since DNA profiling was still a relatively new thing in criminal investigations in 2000, it's suspected that the jury at the civil trial had a hard time understanding Dr. Tarif's testimony about the DNA results, and it failed to sway them about Sam's innocence. One big issue is that while some of these results seem to point away from Sam being the perpetrator, they also pointed away from Eberling as well, even though the Sheppard estate was trying to convince the jury that Eberling did it. For instance, a lot of the blood evidence from the scene was type O, which was Marilyn's blood type, whereas Sam was type A, but the problem is that Eberling was type A as well, even though years earlier, Dr. Paul Leland Kirk had tried to argue that some type O blood found on the closet door near Marilyn's bed belonged to her killer. It was also reported that Sam was excluded as the source of some of the DNA evidence, and Eberling was not, but the portion of the population who could not be excluded was way too large to say with any certainty that the DNA belonged to Eberling. And of course, if contamination took place, it's possible that this unidentified DNA could belong to some lab technician or policeman who didn't handle the evidence properly decades earlier. I know that DNA testing has advanced a great deal these past 25 years, and if new testing was performed on the evidence today, there might be more conclusive answers, but the technology was available at the time of the civil trial failed to prove or disprove anything. On the other side of the coin, the forensic analysis that Dr. Kirk performed of the murder scene in 1955 has been used as evidence to support Sam's innocence, but how many of his conclusions were based on junk science? For instance, Kirk felt that the pattern of the blood spatter found on the closet door indicated that Marilyn's killer was left-handed, and since Sam was right-handed, this seemed to point away from him, right? But at the civil trial, a number of modern-day experts testified that there was no sound scientific method to determine with any certainty if a killer is left-handed or right-handed. In addition, Richard Eberling was right-handed, so the Sheppard estate was once again trapped in a catch-22, where the evidence seemed to lean away from both Sam and the alternate suspect they were trying to implicate in the murder. Likewise, Dr. Kirk was convinced that Marilyn's broken teeth were caused by biting her assailant, but many modern-day experts disagreed with this assessment and believe they were the result of blunt force trauma from Marilyn's killer striking her in the mouth. Overall, there isn't much in the way of conclusive evidence that Eberling committed this crime, but I also have to acknowledge that there isn't any evidence to prove he didn't do it either, as he cannot be excluded as being the source of some of the blood and DNA, and his alibi for the night of the murder was that he was at home alone sleeping, which cannot be proven or disproven. So after lingering on this case for 3 episodes, I'm sure you're probably all wondering about my opinion on who the killer is. Well, even though I've gone back and forth and changed my mind multiple times, I've ultimately reached the conclusion that Sam Sheppard probably did this and was the guilty party all along. As a disclaimer, that doesn't mean I believe the evidence was strong enough to convict Sam beyond a reasonable doubt. I still think the original investigation was botched, the media coverage was horribly biased, Sam's constitutional rights were violated, and he did not receive a fair trial, so I definitely wouldn't have convicted him if I was on the jury. However, when all is said and done, I believe there are just a few too many holes in Sam's story for me to believe that an intruder committed this crime. Overall, I do think that the most likely scenario is that for reasons we'll probably never know, Sam and Marilyn got into some sort of heated argument in the guest bedroom in the middle of the night, which eventually escalated into violence when Sam went into a fit of rage and bludgeoned Marilyn to death. I don't know if the murder weapon was a lamp or a flashlight, but I think it was a crime of passion rather than a premeditated murder, and Sam had to improvise and come up with a story to cover up what he did. After getting rid of incriminating evidence, such as the murder weapon and his t-shirt, he pulled a number of drawers out of some desks to stage a fake burglary and put some items inside a canvas bag and left it on the hillside near the house. He also may have gone down onto the beach and lied down in the water in hopes that this would support his story about being knocked out there. I'm guessing that Sam did sustain some legitimate injuries when Marilyn fought back against him, and he probably told his brothers about what happened so they could handle his treatment at the hospital and make everyone believe that his injuries were more severe than they really were. Even though some of the new forensic testing performed in the 1990s seemed to point away from Sam, I'm not entirely sure how much we can trust it, given the age of the evidence and the possibility of contamination. Don't get me wrong, I'm not completely married to this theory, and for all we know, I may wind up changing my mind again sometime after this episode's release. While I'm pretty certain that Esther and Spencer Houck were not responsible for this crime, I still think that Richard Eberling is a compelling alternate suspect, but there just isn't any real solid evidence pointing towards him. I would be more willing to believe Eberling did this if there weren't so many holes in Sam's account of what happened, as I just don't know why an intruder would enter the house and try to sexually assault Marilyn while Sam was sleeping downstairs, and then try to pull off a half-assed burglary and knock Sam unconscious on no less than 2 separate occasions while leaving him alive. The fact that Sam was so vague in his original statements to police, but kept changing or adding details every time he shared his story, indicates to me that he may have been making it up as he went along. All that being said, even though I think Jeffrey MacDonald is guilty of sin and that he's an odious human being, I can also acknowledge that the original investigation into the MacDonald family murders was botched, and there was misconduct in the case, and MacDonald did not receive a fair trial. The same logic applies to Sam Sheppard, as there were just so many mistakes made in his case, and it became such a convoluted mess that the Supreme Court had to intervene. If you think Sam Sheppard got away with murder when his conviction was overturned and he was released from prison, I suppose you can take comfort in the fact that he wound up dead only a few years later at the young age of 46, and became such a train wreck that it's not like he really got much opportunity to enjoy his freedom. However, even though there are a number of documented cases in which a defendant has been posthumously exonerated of a crime they didn't commit long after they're deceased, this is not one of them. Even though the burden of proof at a civil trial is much lower than a criminal trial, I think it's telling that these jurors not only believe the burden of proof for innocence was not met, but 3/4 of them openly said they felt Sam did it, even though they had been granted access to information and forensic evidence which was not available at the previous 2 criminal trials. While I do not believe there was enough evidence to prove Sam's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, I also do not believe there was enough evidence to conclusively prove his innocence either. But even though I lean towards Sam being guilty, this is most definitely a case where the pieces of the puzzle don't entirely fit together, and I really can't think of a scenario which makes 100% complete sense. Whatever happened, this will continue to remain one of the most controversial murder cases of all time, and I'm sure it will be debated and dissected forever. I know this case is over 70 years old and the investigation is officially closed, but if by some small chance you happen to have any new information about the murder of Marilyn Reese Sheppard, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the course of 7 years, our Patreon page has released over 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released an episode about the bizarre story of Monica LeBeau, who discovered that the couple who raised her during childhood were not actually her birth parents, and began to suspect that she had been abducted from her real family. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discussed the 1980 murder of Sherry Jarvis, a victim who was formerly known as the Walker County Jane Doe. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 70 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon these past few weeks, and they are Armando M., Chris T., E. Arsnoff, and Michelle M. Thank you all so much for your support. And before I bring this episode to a close, I'd like to play a promo for another true crime podcast, Killer Communications.
A heavy breather on the line, or maybe a hang-up phone call. A cold letter mailed to taunt police or a victim's family. A mean-spirited email meant to inflict pain on its recipient. What do all of these things have in common? They're all various modes of communication connected to shocking crimes going back decades. I'm Mike Morford, host of the podcast Killer Communications, and in every episode, I tell the story of a case involving some form of sinister contact, whether it's to a victim, their family, police, or the press. For the senders of these communications, it's bold and brazen. For the recipients, it can be frightening or downright terrifying. And you won't believe just how often it happens. Check out Killer Communications right now everywhere you listen to podcasts, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.
I'd also like to remind everyone that later this month, The Trail Went Cold will be appearing at a new event called AdvocacyCon, which is taking place from March the 28th to the 30th at the Indianapolis Marriott East Hotel in Indianapolis, Indiana. It's being put together by fellow podcasters Eric from True Consequences and Melissa and Whitney from Navigating Advocacy, and is intended as a platform for the families of missing and murdered victims. We have a specialized promo code you can use to get a discount on tickets, so if you would like to attend, please visit their website, advocacycon.com, and use code TRAIL10 to get 10% off. Once again, the website is advocacycon.com, and the promo code is TRAIL10 for 10% off tickets. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear in every episode. They've both been with me on this podcast for these entire 9 years and provided tremendous support, and I never would have gotten The Trail Went Cold off the ground without them. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. Anyway, it's surreal to think that The Trail Went Cold is edging ever so closer to being around for an entire decade, but of course, we never would have made it this far without the amazing support of you, the listeners, so thank you very much. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday as we start off year 10 of our podcast with another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.